All right, I want to cover quite a bit today, so we're going to move fairly rapidly. I've put the names on the board that are of interest to us. These are called, although not all of them are included in the class that are called Athenian Pluralists. Athenian Pluralists. So we have looked now at philosophy as it began developing in Ionia. And if we could put a classification on those, we would just sort of casually indicate that they go by the name of, Stephen, these are the Ionian philosophers. We call them the two words.
Corporeal monists.
Okay, corporeal monists, right? More or less in answer to them, in a kind of Cold War. At the time, there was this debate continuing between the Ionians on the one hand and those who were over in Italy, who Joseph we can call generally by the name what? We have the corporeal monists and the
Incorporeal monists.
Thank you, yes, the incorporeal monists. And so that's where the debate is taking place. Now, they are debating, and Greece is in a sense caught in the middle, you know. So you'd say, if we're looking at a map, Ionia would be over here, Italy's over here, and of course Greece is here in the middle. And what takes place, and the people we're interested in today, are those who sort of bring the debate to Athens. And the people that do that are sometimes called the pluralists, usually called the corporeal pluralists. So here's a third category, okay? We have two classes of monists, and now we have a third class, and these are corporeal pluralists. So just in terms of the jargon. All right, so anyway, here are the people. Well, first guy we're interested in is Empedocles. Empedocles never gets to Athens. This is my map of Greece, of course. You can tell Athens is right there. There's the Peloponnese. You've all been there, right? So here's Athens. He never got there. Here's Italy. Here's Sicily. He was always on Sicily, the island. His name is Empedocles. But he was considered one of the first great champions of, or maybe cheerleaders for, what became Athenian democracy. The pluralism of Athens translates politically into democracy. Democracy is pluralistic, right? You have all kinds of people vying for control, forming little factions and so on, and competing with each other. As you know, last year from civics, when we studied James Madison and others, we found concern about the factions that arise in a democracy. Well, here's kind of the original impulse, and Empedocles is in some ways the kind of spiritual patron behind Athenian democracy. Stephen.
I was wondering, what was the other name you said for the Athenian pluralists?
Corporeal pluralists. Yeah, corporeal. Oddly enough, though, Empedocles never made it to Athens. It was just his influence. He died by casting himself into Mount Etna. Which was at the time an active volcano. He did that in order to perpetuate a sort of myth about Empedocles that he was semi-divine. And he thought it would tarnish his reputation if they found his dead body somewhere. So he thought the best way to make sure he was never found as a dead body was to cast himself into Mount Etna. His reported last words were, Geronimo. No, that's just kidding. Empedocles is the guy who first of all gives us the great classic fourfold definition of the elements. And what are they, Matthew? You can tick them off.
Earth, air, fire, and water.
There they are. We've seen others kicking those around. He is a pluralist because notice he's not trying to reduce everything to one element, but he finally decides there's got to be four. It's the only way to account for the life that he is perceiving. And if you think about it, even though it seems a little rudimentary, a little backwards from our point of view, we think, oh, how silly, earth, air, fire, and water, for goodness sakes, give me a break. How come these people don't have brains? Really, if you think about it, you realize there is a kind of rationale to it. For example, if I were to go over and shoot Sidney through the head, and he were to die, and then we just, as an experiment, of course, nothing personal, Sidney, but then we came back about 3, 5, 6 months later, what would we find where Sidney used to be? What would we find there? It might take a little longer than 6 months. It wouldn't smell good for a while in here, if we just leave his body and came back later. But Sidney, what would we find where Sidney used to be? You, Sidney, where that Sidney used to be. After enough time, the human body...
Did you kill him in here?
Yeah, in here, right. Yeah, it's an experiment. Yeah.
I think he would eventually just decompose.
Decompose into what? Earth. So the ancients noticed that. They noticed that bodies deteriorate back into earth. And they noticed that most stuff does. They didn't have styrofoam or other things that don't deteriorate. They just had, everything seemed to go back to earth. So it seemed that fundamentally everything has earth in it. Why fire? What's the fire bring to the discussion? Why would they say fire is one of the elements? Krista?
Fire destroys earth?
No, not exactly. Not exactly. What is the most conspicuous feature of fire? Jacob, when you think of fire, you think of what? It's hot. Heat. They would notice that even though we find dirt where Sidney used to be, the dirt is cold. And they think, where'd the heat come from? There must have also been some kind of fire. Or at least some sort of warmth, some warming influence that they call fire. Earth, air. Why air? Why do you suppose air is in the picture? Ben, what do you think? Earth, air, fire, and water.
Air is life.
Okay. They notice the dirt is not breathing. They also notice that anytime you begin depriving a person of air, it's not too long before they what? Josiah? Die. Thank you. Nicely done. Why water? Why was water part of the mix? Jordan?
It means if you deprive somebody of water.
Exactly. You see the logic? When they ask themselves, especially about the human species, but they saw it in all of nature. They saw it in trees and stuff. They saw... It seems as if these are the four qualities that really do kind of account for life as we experience it. And so that fourfold idea came from Empedocles. That's another claim to fame. Empedocles also, however, kept wishing he could find the essence behind the essences. So there's four essences, earth, air, fire, and water. He was trying to figure out what would be what he called the fifth essence. Does anyone know the term you'll hear to this day that stands for the essence behind the essences, or the fifth essence? You'll sometimes hear the expression. Anybody know the term that's used? The blank essence. Anybody know this term? The quintessence. You ever heard that term? Who's heard that term? That's where it comes from. The fifth essence. Okay? The essence behind the essences. The quintessence. So, if you ask, well, what are you getting? We're getting philosophy and math and Christian literature and stuff. Then somebody says, well, yeah, but what's really the quintessence of what you're getting? Well, what they're asking is, what's behind all of that? What's the really fundamental, truth or value or education that you're getting? And then you might think about, well, what? Christian worldview or something. I don't know what you'd answer. But it would have something to do with philosophy. All right, so these these elements combine. Empedocles says the forces that combine them there's also a force that sort of separates them. So it's a constant flux. And he called the force that combines them love, and the force that separates them hate. And so he incorporates into his philosophy some kind of emotional qualities. But remember, he's a corporeal pluralist. He doesn't believe that anything exists which is not material. So even love is sort of like a magnet, drawing things together. Hate is like the opposite. You put the two ends of the magnet together and they repel. That sort of thing. It's still a material force. A few other little tidbits about Empedocles. He's the first guy in history that we know of who maintained that light travels at a fixed speed. It is not just there, it takes time. Now, he didn't exactly compute the speed of light. Given a little more time, he might have. But what is the speed of light? First of all, does light travel at a fixed speed? Answer, yes. And the speed is, Avery?
I know that it takes 8 minutes for the sunlight to get to the earth.
That's very good. It takes about 8 minutes. That's right.
I don't know how far.
Okay. Anybody know the speed of light off the top of your head? Just to confirm Empedocles here. Anybody know? 186,000 miles a second? You know that? All right. That is it. Make a note of that. I may test you on that someday. Okay, so that's Empedocles.
Wait.
Yes.
How did he even figure that out?
He was smart. He was a smart guy.
That's a hard one.
I know it. It is. These guys are geniuses. You have to keep in mind they're geniuses that lived in the ancient world. How did Einstein, when he's driving along one day in a bus, and he happens to look up at a clock, get the notion that the faster you go, the more time slows down? Where does that come from? I wish I knew the answer. But I think you have to be a genius to kind of understand how a genius brain operates. All right, next guy is Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras is the first of these characters to actually show up in Athens. Notice his dates. 500 to 428. What happens in Athens that's important during those dates? What is the background for the life of Anaxagoras as he's living out? He moves to Athens at about the year 480, so he's about 20 years old, and he's there for the duration. What's going on in Athens during those years?
Isn't that the time of the
Persian Wars. He's there during the Persian Wars. He gets there shortly after the Second Persian War, the defeat of the Persians at Salamis. Okay? And then what happens in the succeeding years? He's there during that entire period that we call the Golden Age. Thank you. When Pericles builds the Parthenon. And so Anaxagoras is a good friend of Pericles. They're buddies. Anaxagoras is one of a number of philosophers who sort of are in the inner circle in Athens. And he is floating his understanding of how we, grasp the nature of reality. He liked the idea of separate elements, but he didn't like the idea that there were only four. He thought the earth, air, fire, and water didn't account for enough things. But he didn't know just how many elements there were, and so to play it safe, he said he believed there were an infinite number of elements. Not just four, not even five with the quintessence, but an infinite number of separate and distinct elements. And he called those elements seeds. Seeds. Sperma is the Greek word. Because he looked at nature and he saw strange things. He saw a brown cow in the field eating green grass to produce white milk. You ever thought about that, Kayla? That's kind of amazing, isn't it? Brown cow, green grass, white milk. And he thought to himself, how does that happen? You know, where does white milk come from? And he decided that there must have been the seeds of the white milk in the green grass. And somehow there's a little bit of everything in everything. That was kind of where he finally wound up. Because he saw not just brown cows, he saw all of life producing strange effects. And he wondered, how does that happen? And so he gave us this notion of a kind of seed theory of reality. And that's why he's a pluralist, because rather than reducing everything to one thing, he's reducing it to an infinite number of tiny little sort of seeds. That may or may not be of much interest to you, but something he also brought to the discussion, which was of some interest and played an important part in Greek thought, was the notion of the nous. He said that the thing that sort of organized all these seeds was what he called the nous, which is the Greek word for, anybody know? Greek word for? Nous. We sometimes in theology speak of the noetic effects of sin. That'd be the effect of sin on your nous. The nous is, anybody know? Spencer? No, but you're close. That'd be the psyche. The suke would be the soul. The nous is the mind. Okay, so it's there's a mind, and he uses the term very, very similarly to the way in which Heraclitus had used the term logos. You could almost say they're equal. It's a very similar use of the word. Socrates got kind of excited about that. All right. Next guy that's of interest to us, Democritus. Giving you his dates, you'll notice that he is born, so his youth is during this golden age, but then he also lives through the Peloponnesian Wars as an Athenian. And he's the first, what's called atomist. The first guy to come up with a true atomic theory. You've heard his name before in that connection? Chemistry, yeah. You should have, at least you should have gotten, somebody should have tipped their hat to Democritus in chemistry, because he's the first guy that actually gave us this idea. The Roman, by the way, who followed Democritus is a guy named Lucretius, so you'll sometimes hear his name in the same connection. Basically, Democritus said this. He doesn't like Anaxagoras' notion of an infinite number of atoms, or I shouldn't say of atoms, but of particles of elements. He thinks that if we could get down to the substructure of all reality, we'll find that everything is made of the same stuff. Now, he didn't quite get to neutrons, protons, electrons, and quarks. You know, he didn't quite get that far, but not far from it. He did say that if you get down to the minusculely tiny particles by which all things exist, subsist, that they're all made of the same thing, but they are different shapes. It's rather remarkable. It really is not unlike atomic theory as you know it. You know, now it's not quite there, but not far from it. When he says different shapes, he talked in terms of some of these particles are smooth, some are rough, some have little hooks, little angles, and so on. But what he meant by all of that was simply that these are the ways that cause them to combine together in different forms to form what we would call compounds. You know, we say, well, you know, you've got an atomic particle and it may have 2 electrons or 3 electrons. It may, you know, we talk about those shapes differently, but it's the same fundamental idea. Was that your hand, Alicia? Go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you said that he has different shapes. Is it kind of like, do you believe it was like a puzzle almost?
Almost, yeah, exactly. That's the idea. So these things hang together. Like if you get 2 particles that have hooks that can grab each other, then they do grab each other. And then you get a couple of more that grab together, and then a few more randomly bumping into each other, and after a while, out comes Nicole. I'm serious. Nicole is just the product of a random, accidental collision of atoms. And they all kind of ran into each other in a certain configuration, and by pure, purposeless accident, here comes Nicole. Not to mention the rest of us, you see. Now, that may seem a little humorous to put it quite that way, but what would you say is the prevailing view of how human life has come to be in the world today? Not a lot different from that, is it? You know? There was some slime somewhere, a little sludge, and by pure accident, some amino acids bumped into each other and created DNA. And there, well, you know, it's an amoeba. And then it figured out how to split, and 2 or 3 billion years later, here is... Right? Right? I mean, really, isn't that pretty contemporary? So, even though they conceived of it a little bit differently, it's the same idea. He said that the reason that some things are sweet and some are sour is that if you eat food that is largely made up of nice, smooth little atoms, it'll feel sweet on your tongue, but if they're little thorny atoms, then it'll be kind of sour, and so on. He has a completely, totally mechanistic view of the universe. There is no free will, there is no responsibility. You are just part of this machine that is cranking along by sheer, unguided, purposeless accident. You know. So, Democritus is also associated with hedonism. What's the point of life? Well, you're just here by accident. You're going to be gone pretty soon. About the only point that he could come up with is just, you know, get as much pleasure as you can in the meantime. And that is typically the philosophy, the ethic that's associated with materialism. You know, just enjoy it while you got it, because pretty soon you're going to be gone. Forever. And so, what's the point of life? Get a little pleasure in the meantime, call it quits. So that was his response. Not surprisingly, he's the one who lives through the Peloponnesian Wars. And one of the great effects of the Peloponnesian Wars on many people in Greece was that life is just meaningless. Here we had the greatest, you know, civilization in the world. We fought off the Persians. We stood up to Xerxes, sent him home, crying to mommy. So we should be the most happy, wonderful, fulfilled people, and then what do? We build the Parthenon, we celebrate, and then we just beat ourselves to a pulp. And by the time that was over, you know, here you've got Democritus now, who's kind of a late middle-aged guy, 60 years old, asking himself, what is this all about? And he just decides it's all meaningless. And that we're just here as a bunch of kind of accidental particles. We're going to be gone soon enough. We forget trying to get meaning out of it. Philosophy does ride on top of political events, and at the same time, political events are sometimes driven by philosophy. There's a relationship here. You know, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So anyway, that's Democritus. 2 more I want to mention to you, and I've given you. These guys would all be corporeal pluralists. Okay. Then there's 2 other movements that pop on the scene at the time. One is called the Sophists, and one is called the Cynics. Sophists, Cynics. In a sense, the Sophists represent the philosophy of despair that generally arose here in the Greek world based on the fact that the Ionians and the Italians could not agree, and they both seemed brilliant. Okay. So you've got a Heraclitus, and Heraclitus says the only thing you can depend on is change, the flux. And it seems that he's onto something. You look at the world around you and wow, it does seem, in fact, that that's really the way things are. Just always fluctuating. And so Heraclitus has almost persuaded you. That's got to be the way it is. Then all of a sudden, you start reading a little bit of Parmenides. And you read Zeno's Paradoxes. And you go, whoa, boy, I'm not sure I can answer. And you're just an ordinary person. You're not a genius. You're just a rank and file person. And you've got this genius Parmenides over here, and this genius Heraclitus over here, and those two guys who are so smart cannot agree with each other, Josiah. And then you think to yourself, what am I going to do? What do you think to yourself? Josiah, two brilliant guys, can't agree. I mean, Josiah's a smart guy, but on the other hand, it's like having Einstein on one hand and some other great mathematical genius on the other. What do you do if they can't agree? What do you do?
Well, you could... I guess you have a couple options. You could just completely despair about it and say that no one can figure this out.
That's right.
Or you could try to assimilate the two. But
Okay, both are correct. That's a very good answer. The guy of average intelligence has to go with option 1. You see? Hey, this is way beyond me. And you just reach that point of kind of despair. And the despair translates into this: nobody knows the answers to the big questions. This is called philosophical skepticism. If you happen to be Josiah, another equally brilliant guy, then you go for option 2. And the guy that comes along and does that, we call Plato. You see, that's his great claim to he synthesizes Parmenides and Heraclitus, but until Plato comes along, you're in this period of skepticism. And the two philosophies associated with skepticism in Athens in this period are the Sophists and the Cynics. Okay? The Sophists, who also were influenced by Athenian democracy, say, hey, nobody knows the answers to the big questions. What really matters is if you can answer the small questions. How to be happy, how to influence people, how to get what you want out of life, how to get more pay, how to ask your boss for a raise, how to run for political office and talk to people so persuasively that they'll actually vote for you. The fine art of being a demagogue. All of the stuff that's related to life in a democracy. We don't care about big questions. In a pure democracy, listen to me, in a pure democracy, the right answer is simply what the majority votes for at any given moment. That's all. Truth is not upstairs. Truth is a matter of counting noses. And if a majority says 2 plus 2 equals 3, then I'm telling you 2 plus 2 does equal 3, at least that day. You know what I'm saying? It's a despair of big answers to big questions. It's a philosophy of little answers to little questions that are going to make you happy in the meantime, or give you power or influence or popularity or whatever you want. Sophism. Sophism is the philosophy of getting what you want through the refined use of rhetoric. And so the Sophists were really the first great champions of rhetoric, which may strike you as somewhat ironic, because of course here we are somewhat proud of the fact that part of our educational regime, our educational paradigm, involves this crowning discipline that we call what? Nicole? Rhetoric. And what is rhetoric? Right? You're in the rhetoric phase here. You've taken rhetoric 1, you're in the middle of rhetoric 2, so you can give me now a discussion, a quick definition of rhetoric. It is what?
The art of...
Oh dear.
Something about the available modes of persuasion.
Okay, that's right. Laura, what is rhetoric?
Well, the definition Aristotle gives us is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion.
All right, okay, listen to it. The available means of persuasion. And if you're a sophist, then it's the means of persuasion is the most important thing. What you're trying to persuade people of is really up to you. See, there's a real relativism of it, but we do think it's nice for you to have the tools of persuasion. We want to get what's good from these sophists, but we don't want to adopt their underlying philosophy of a kind of despair, skeptical, relativistic meaninglessness. Does that make sense? So we think they did some good things in terms of working out principles of persuasion, because they are the first people that did that. We think, however, oddly enough, that great discipline was the product of an unfortunate philosophy of meaninglessness that is not quite so helpful. All right, so those are the sophists. The most famous of them was a guy by the name of Protagoras. Protagoras. He is the most famous sophist. Spencer.
So, Democritus thought everything was meaningless, but just for a different reason?
Yeah, all of these people are in that kind of a general view of life is, in the bigger scheme of things, meaningless.
Okay. The sophists thought it was meaningless because they just didn't know how to answer the big questions? Or what?
They thought, well, there's a relationship there. They thought, they were influenced by the fact that the Ionians and the Italians couldn't agree. Okay? And so, in a sense, they give up the battle. Why try? Nobody can figure this. It's too hard. So what do we do in the meantime? We do something more pedestrian, more this worldly, right? Protagoras advocated his famous phrase, you want to know this, his most famous little motto goes like this: Homo mensura. Homo mensura, which means, anybody ever heard that expression, homo mensura? It's kind of a famous little phrase. It's the classic creed of humanism. Man is the measure. What's the measure of truth? Man. Not God, not transcendent values. You. You are the measure of truth. Truth is that which is true for you. Which, by the way, is the prevailing philosophy on the average college campus in America today. So, this is not, we're not far from this. Reminds me of a conversation I had. I probably told you about this sometime or other when I was in college with a guy. I was a Christian, he was an atheist. And I was trying to persuade him that he should be a Christian, that he should believe in God and trust Christ and so on. And he looks at me, very intelligent guy, and he says, hey, look, that philosophy of believing in God, I can see that really works for you, makes your life meaningful. I can see that it just kind of juices you up and gets you excited, and I think that's great. In fact, I think for you, Bruce, there is a God. He said, but I find the whole God hypothesis stifling to my creativity. The notion that there's a God out here prevents me from being fully and truly what I want to be. It puts me in a kind of straitjacket. And so, hey, for me, there is no God. Why can't we just live and let live? For you, there's a God. For me, there's not a God. And he was perfectly happy to just walk away friends based on that. Now, Megan, if you were having that conversation with my friend, how might you respond to that particular proposition? It was very Protagorean, right? It was very much Protagoras' response. How do you think you might respond to someone who said something like that to you?
Well, I might say something about the reason we have laws in our country, and the Bible gives us the law by which we live, and if we didn't have those, then we wouldn't be very happy at all.
All right. Certainly as a practical matter, that's true. How would you, Josiah, how would you respond to that? If this guy says, I say to you, Josiah, for you there's a God. It's great. It's wonderful. I have no argument. For you, that's your truth. My truth is atheism. I find that much more fulfilling. So let's just be friends and we'll leave it at that.
The biggest contradiction is, what if my truth says that your truth is not true?
Now don't start force feeding your truth to me. I mean, don't impose your value. You have your truth, I have mine. Let's just leave it at that.
Well, I'm still saying is that there's a contradiction, because when I have truth that's relative, that means
I know, but you see, you lapse into this use of words like contradiction. Don't you see? You're just becoming a victim of Aristotelian logic and those laws of contradiction. Why can't we just have our own separate truths? Sure, they contradict each other, but who cares? I mean, that's just kind of this old-fashioned idea that truth has to be consistent. You have yours, I have mine. Let's just call it good.
Well, all I can say is then, I can push the envelope by saying, well, what is it okay for me to do anything I want then?
Okay, yeah, you can start, that's right, reductio ad absurdum. You can start pushing the envelope, and that's a very good way to do it.
Because there has to be some type of standard that all people have to...
Well, you think so. You'd think so. But you're going to be surprised at the very smart people. And next year, some of you are going off to Pagan U somewhere. Not all of you, but some of you. And I endorse it. I'm for it. I want you to go out there as people ready to have these conversations, because you're going to talk to very intelligent people who will say to you exactly what I just said, or something like it. What I said to my friend was, the problem we've got here is aside from whether you believe in God or I believe in God or whatever, there's still the question, is there actually a God out there? And the fact that you don't believe in him ain't going to make him go away if he's there. Nor is the fact that I do believe in him going to create him if he's not there. There is this objective question, and if God is there and you're going to stand before him someday, it seems to me you'd be a little bit worried about that. You know what he says? No, there you go, imposing your views on me again. Can't we just live and let live? So, you can't reason with someone who is committed to absurdity. You understand that? You cannot reason with absurdity. You can point it out. Well, Protagoras gives us a kind of absurdity in which the man is the measure. Plato attacked that with a vengeance. This is why Christians many times like Plato, because he sides with what seem to be very Christian outlooks, at various times on issues like that. All right, the other guy is Diogenes. I'll just do this really rapidly in the last 3.5 minutes here. Diogenes. He's called a cynic. You are seniors, so I'm going to say this to you, even though some people might think it's in somewhat poor taste. But I want you to get the idea of the roots of the word cynicism. Cynicism has its roots in a Greek word that describes a behavior of male dogs with respect to fire hydrants. You with me? Okay? So get that image in your mind. And I want you to think instead that the cynic was someone who engaged in the very same behavior toward all things in society that were polite or respectable, viewed all of these things with disdain. So a cynic is somebody who just goes around poo-pooing everything. Nothing matters. All of your academic robes this and your credentials that and all of the respect you think you deserve, they just kind of walk away from it believing all of that is just a bunch of nonsense, and in a sense what they want to do is just essentially urinate on all of it. Okay? That is cynicism. You'll run into some of that on a college campus too. People who just are completely unwilling to believe anything about anything. And it comes off initially as sort of an academic sophistication, but at the heart of it, it's just this kind of vacuous, empty, kind of attitude of a sort of arrogance, really. That was Diogenes. He's famous for a couple of images. Probably the most famous image associated with Diogenes is he's going through the Athenian agora in broad daylight with a lantern, brightly lit in broad daylight. And he's going around like that, broad daylight with this lantern, and he's looking. And somebody says, "What are you looking for, Diogenes?" And he says, what? Anybody know that image? A very famous image in Western civilization. Diogenes looking for an honest man. Message: nobody. There's nobody on. Nobody speaks the truth. Except, of course, Diogenes, the cynic, you see. And so this is his kind of, his dismissal of all things that are otherwise respected as he goes around. The other one is that he lived in a bathtub, usually naked. He would take his bathtub out, set it in the sun in the agora, and flop down in his bathtub right there. And that was just his commentary on life in Athens, you know. So there's more stories about Diogenes, but unfortunately time has run out.